Hey everyone, Happy New Year. Let's not just hope it's a great one, let's make it a great one. So, last time you saw me, it was just before that little US election, and I made some waves with my video, got a lot of excited responses in every direction as usual, mostly well-behaved stuff. But I'm not speaking about the US election or its results in this video. I'm speaking about a word that I put in the title of that video, though, in big, bold, red letters, genocide. So, to be honest, I've been slow to use that word over the past year, and some of you have probably noticed that, and either pushed me to use it, or a few of you immediately, if I did use it, thought I was out of my mind and a lost cause when I finally said genocide. And this conversation that I had with the scholar and author Dirk Moses should perfectly illuminate why that is. My hesitation was not at all for lack of being supremely outraged, horrified, disgusted, sickened, etc. Words really do fail here. In fact, in so many ways, my hesitancy to use the G word is precisely because of how worried and sickened and outraged I am, and that I do feel strange about the moral weight that that word carries. And I really trust that that will all make a lot of sense to you after listening to me and Dirk Moses. This word genocide is just such a massive emotional landmine, I think, in all of our minds. Obviously, especially for Jews, like my family. I've even noticed that people in the comments seem to try to wiggle around the algorithms by spelling it with different symbols and whatnot. By the way, I have no idea if that stuff works. Can't imagine that it really does, but it's kind of interesting. But it really does go to the point of just how radioactive and inflamed this particular word has become. And Dirk Moses thinks that that is really a problem. In fact, he thinks it's a rather big problem, and just one of many, which is why he wrote a book entitled The Problems of Genocide, which is really what the bulk of our conversation is about. But as an introduction to our talk, I want to tell you an exemplary story, which also tells you a little bit about myself and my track to these questions. So before my conversation was scheduled with Dirk, he was kind enough to email me and share an article from an upcoming journal, it's Jewish Currents, and it was an article by Mary Cohen, which I think should be public in a few weeks. Do bookmark it if you can now. I'll put a link to it down in the description. So the article is entitled, "Can Genocide Studies Survive a Genocide in Gaza?" You'll hear us reference it a bit in the talk. And it's funny how small the world is sometimes, because Dirk didn't know when he sent it to me just how much that article intertwined with my life and my intellectual career and path to these questions. So I won't rehash the Jewish childhood stuff and my commitment to never-againism, which I detail in other essays if you're interested. But the relevant piece here is that I was at university early in my college days and pursuing my degree in film when 9/11 happened. And that event is really what jump-started my entire ongoing moral philosophy quests. I just dove into moral philosophy and political philosophy and was just overflowing with a lot of difficult questions. I still continued on and got my film degree, but I was lucky enough to be at a university where I could take plenty of classes outside of my main degree path. And my school, Clark University, it's in Worcester, Massachusetts, happened to have a center called the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I think it's actually recognized as the first of its kind in the entire world, where one could pursue a PhD, which I didn't do. I got my film degree. So anyway, I ended up taking a ton of classes at this center, at this department, and some really fascinating ones that exposed me not just to history, but some philosophical debates about things like resistance and justified violence and things like that, and questions of what terrorism perhaps is. And some of the classes were really incredible. They had like Holocaust survivors sitting in with us who would give us first-hand accounts of just really interesting stuff. And so this was like 2002, 2003-ish. I don't recall many, if any, conversations about Israel and its stance towards the Palestinians. I remember my classes being much more focused on Europe in the late 30s and 40s. It was pretty Holocaust-centric rather than genocide-focused. I do know some of the names that Dirk will mention, actually, including Yehuda Bauer, who conducted a few popular visiting lectures at my school. He came one time and told this incredible story of children at a villa. It was called Villa Emma in Italy that really captivated me, of, I think it was teenagers and children, maybe hundreds even, at this monastery that was secretly hiding them and educating them throughout the entire war. Anyway, really fascinating stuff to live through. So anyway, the question now, and I mean now in 2025, that was not being considered or asked when I was in school. That question of, is Israel conducting a genocide in Gaza and potentially the West Bank? What does it mean to even ask that question, let alone answer it? It seems quite relevant for genocide studies. And this shouldn't be very surprising, but these centers and academic departments, of which there are now several all over the world, are tearing themselves apart because of this Israel question. You can imagine that many of these departments are filled with people who might have some conflicting feelings about the state of Israel, the Holocaust, their Judaism, of course, which is overrepresented in these departments, and the term genocide. Already, probably some of you can spot a problem with wondering whether the name genocide and Holocaust studies is strangely redundant. Is that not like saying cucumbers and vegetable studies? That's a joke from the article he sent me, by the way. I'm not that clever, so we also repeat it in the talk. And that's really part of the issue. So at Clark University, apparently this is all really bubbled over, which I kept a little bit of an eye on. Now I'll tell the story. So here's the story. A woman by the name of Mary Jane Ryan had served as the executive director for about 20 years. She started there in 1998, so our paths did cross, though I don't recall any extensive interaction with her, but I do recall her presence. Mary was always very active in the Jewish community. She happens to be Jewish. She was on the board of the Jewish Federation of Central Massachusetts and the congregation Beth Israel. She was and still is an ardent supporter and defender of Israel. And that's not an understatement. This is to the point that she received an honor from Israel Bonds in 2019, which is an organization that facilitates investments in the state of Israel through the issuance of securities. So that should paint a bit of a picture for you. I think it probably goes without saying that Mary Jane Ryan certainly does not think that Israel is committing a genocide. So, after the Hamas attacks on October 7th and the horror show ever since, when this conversation really starts ramping up, fast forward to March 13th, 2024, she helps organize an event which is at Worcester State University. So not Clark University, where she worked, but Worcester State is just a few miles down the road. And the event is billed like this: Perspectives of an IDF First Responder, October 7th in Israel and Gaza. And the IDF responder is a man by the name of Sharar Peled. The flyer says that Sharar helped restabilize Israeli towns and capture Hamas terrorists on the Gaza border. You can go ahead and read into the restabilize Israeli towns part and what that means he likely did. It's rather interesting flat language. And then the flyer goes on to say that Shahar joined the informational war against the evil propaganda of Hamas when he saw the grave contrast between what was happening in the field versus what was falsely being portrayed by the media. I don't have to read the whole flyer, but to give you a taste of what Mr. Sharar Pelad was up to, here he is on Newsmax 2, which is a full-on right-wing propaganda outlet, flat out lying about seeing beheaded babies.
Who is known as Shahar. We're just going to use his first name for security reasons, and there he is. Shahar, welcome to Newsmax and Newsmax 2.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So you were there reacting to the October 7th terror attacks. What did you see that we need to know about?
I think some of you saw it on social media. We have seen a terror organization that wanted to kill as many people as they could in the least amount of times, and not just kill, but massacre in the most horrible way, mutilate bodies, rape women, behead babies, burn them alive in the thousands, over 1,200 people in a few hours. And we've seen it in real time, things that we can't really unsee, smells we can't unsmell. You know, it was a long time ago. It feels like a lifetime ago. It was 3.5 months ago. And ever since so much has happened, we've been to Gaza. We're fighting the fight of our lives to get our people back and ensure this never happens again.
Okay, so needless to say, it's already pretty troubling that an executive director of a Holocaust and Genocide Studies department at a major university is helping organize this event. And it should be no surprise to her or anyone else that this event drew a lot of criticism, and protesters showed up outside the event as well as inside of it. So the event got underway, and when Sherar started speaking, it was interrupted by a fire alarm and chanting, and the students then walked out. Here's a little taste of that.
1,000 Palestinians have been killed! Free Palestine! The IDF are terrorists! IDF are terrorists! Genocide supporter! Genocide supporter!
Terrorists! IDF are terrorists!
30,000 Palestinians have been killed because of your army!
So Mary Jane Ryan had introduced Sherar at the event, and she was rather upset. And when she found out that Clark's students were among the protesters, she demanded that the school discipline them. Again, mind you, this was an event off campus. So anyway, good on the school for basically telling her to get lost, and that it was insane to ask a school to discipline students for something they did off campus, especially something like this. Anyway, she wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal called Why I'm Leaving Clark University, and it has the subtitle, As a Jew and a Scholar, I Feel a Warmer Welcome at Assumption, a Catholic institution. She joined Assumption College. She plays victim throughout. It's worth reading if you're interested, but you probably won't learn too much from it. But to just give you a taste of the problem we're dealing with here, Mary wrote a guest column for the Telegram and Gazette, which she finished up with this. These are just the last two paragraphs straight from her. Just as elite institutions of higher education are grappling with an epidemic of anti-Semitism on their campuses, K-12 educational systems must address the fears that Jewish students, parents, and teachers have expressed. School curricula that elide Jewish experience or code Jews as oppressors may be factors in fostering the repugnant attitudes towards Jews that we have witnessed in the aftermath of October 7th. The state of Holocaust education and its seeming failure may turn out to be a useful barometer for whether Jewish students, as well as teachers, feel seen and safe at school. What we are observing today is reminiscent of the way teachers and professors during the Third Reich indoctrinated students in the Nazi worldview. Ironically, we don't seem to have learned that lesson. So you heard me right. She apparently thinks that we're in Third Reich indoctrination territory by, suggesting that Jews can in fact act in the roles of oppressor, or dare I say, commit the crime of the dreaded G word. So anyway, Mary is gone from Clark University, and I'm actually rather proud of the school there for not letting her or her very donor-friendly positions bully them. But it should really give you a taste of the state of things in genocide and Holocaust studies in academia, and prepare you for this conversation with Dirk Moses. But Dirk's work and this conversation is also not just an academic exercise. It really is about doing something, and how language can actually be a major obstacle in that quest. And perhaps a fixation on the word genocide, or a particular case at the ICJ brought by South Africa, or in online debates about who's committing genocide, all of that itself really does have a lot of problems. So to introduce you to the conversation, I'm going to read the opening paragraph of Dirk Moses' book, The Problems of Genocide. So this is Dirk. Genocide is a problem in two ways. Not only the terrible fact of mass death, but also how the relatively new idea and law of genocide organizes and distorts our thinking about civilian, that is non-combatant, destruction. Taking the normative perspective of civilian immunity from military attack that international law and norms ostensibly prioritize, this book argues that their implicit hierarchy, atop which sits genocide as the crime of crimes, blinds us to other types of humanly caused civilian death, like bombing cities and the collateral damage of missile and drone strikes, blockades, and sanctions. In other words, talk of genocide functions ideologically to detract attention from systemic violence against civilians perpetrated by governments, including Western ones. The Problems of Genocide also contends that this violence is the consequence of permanent security imperatives, the striving of states and armed groups seeking to found states to make themselves invulnerable to threats. Permanent security is the unattainable goal of absolute safety that necessarily results in civilian casualties by its paranoid tendency to indiscriminate violence. To solve the problem of genocide, concealing permanent security, this book proposes replacing the former with the latter, permanent security. should be illegal. I think you'll soon see how much I really loved talking to Dirk Moses, and I'm sure you're going to love the conversation as well. I'm also going to be back at the end with a little wrap-up that ended up kind of turning into, I think, a pretty good standalone essay that actually gets into the mythology of X-Men, of all things. Also a nod to a video essay from a channel called From the Periphery that I really liked as well. So stick around for that if you have the time. I think I laid out some pretty important stuff there as well. So Happy New Year, and enjoy, I suppose, something worse than genocide. So how did you get into these things? What's your story to be where you are?
So as your listeners and viewers can hear, I'm Australian and not the US. But the commonality is that these are both settler colony societies or successor societies of settler colonial projects, in many ways ongoing from an Indigenous perspective, because their land is constantly coveted and their resources and so forth. Just have to think about the controversies about pipelines in this country, which are ongoing. So, I grew up in a pretty racist environment in Queensland, which is like the Texas of Australia, or the south of Australia. We call it the deep north. And, it's on the right-hand corner of Australia, top right-hand corner. But the state is massive. It's about 2.5 times the size of Texas. Has a large Indigenous population by Australian standards, because most of southeastern Australia was wiped out of Indigenous people, 150 years ago. So further north and inland you get, and coastal as well, and coastal towns, you have many more Indigenous people, as well as at my high school and at university. So there's always this sense that even if you're a naive child, that, that there's, we weren't the first people here, and the explorers were, even in the 70s when I was a boy, depicted as kind of heroes. But, as you became sentient as a high school student in the 80s, you realize there's something wrong, but you don't have the vocabulary or intellectual tools to really digest that till you're at university, where I studied history, politics and law, and observed Indigenous activism on the campus without really understanding it. And then I went to graduate school in the US. I went to Notre Dame for a master's and then UC Berkeley for the PhD, and became engrossed in European intellectual history. My parents, were academics. My father taught German history at the University of Queensland for nearly 30 years. My mother's German, so there's a heritage there. And there was always consciousness of German history, the Holocaust, and so forth in our household, although it was not a Jewish household. But there were always academics from Israel and Germany passing through the university and the house when my father had them as guests and so forth. So, I think my parents dragged us as children to Israel and on a trip to Europe, in late 1976. So I have, very vague memories of it, very vague. In any event, at graduate school, my interest was in Germany, not Australia, despite this, background. In fact, many of us grew up in Australia, especially in towns like Brisbane, are doing our best to escape, because they're such ghastly places. And, well, at least they were then in the 70s and 80s. And I, spent years studying in Germany, doing the research, and did a book on German intellectuals in the Nazi past. So the emphasis there was on memory, intellectual history, theorists, philosophers, sociologists, and how they dealt with the legacy of the Nazi past. And in fact, the interview project in the dissertation revolved around talking to people who had been in the Hitler Youth or young soldiers at the end of the war. So they were born in the 1920s or to the early 30s, which is, actually my father's generation, but leaving that aside. But they were still alive and kicking in the late 90s when I was interviewing them in Germany. We're talking about Ralph Dahrendorf, Jürgen Habermas, who's still with us, although born in 1929. And these are the people who shaped the intellectual and political culture of the Federal Republic of Germany. And they were the generation older than the student revolutionary generation, who were born in the early 40s and to the mid 40s. They were 20 in 1968. So go back, they're born 1948. Okay, sort of. Yeah. So this is a generation before that. It was their teachers. They were the young professors in the 60s. but they weren't established Nazis during the war. That was their own teachers. They were young enough at the end of the war, because they went back to high school or to university in these bombed out campuses after they got out of POW camps in the mid-late 40s. They had to confront the ruins of Germany, and they'd been implicated in that. But they were kids in many ways, or very young people, like our undergraduates. Okay, and so they're in their dissertations, which I studied. They worked through the German intellectual traditions, whether in philosophy or sociology or what have you, to understand how we got to this catastrophe. Now, their focus was less the Holocaust than 1933, like how did the Nazis come to power, then the war, which had engulfed their lives, destroyed their families, and of course, and they were aware of this, covered the country in guilt and shame and international stigma. And they were the generation that had to sort of reconstruct Germany intellectually and morally, as well as economically and so forth. In any event, these were the issues that occupied my mind in the 1990s when I was at grad school. But at the same time, in Australia, in the second half of the 90s, you had this very intense debate about the policy and practice of taking mixed, quote unquote, mixed race Indigenous children from their families and putting them in white institutions or families. Now, that practice went on into the 60s. So in my lifetime. And obviously, Indigenous families have been well aware of this, all too aware the whole time, but, white settler society, less so. But an official commission of inquiry, a government commission of inquiry was instituted. I can't recall exactly when. I'm guessing that the early 90s. And then it reported, I think, in 1997. And then the debate really became public because it was an official, massive report, a bit like the Truth and Reconciliation report in Canada a few years ago. And that report alleged cultural genocide. The Australian report alleged actual genocide, because one of the articles of the Genocide Convention is a transfer of children, with the intent to destroy a group and whole or in part. And so this led to this, very intense, fractious debate in Australia. And I ended up writing about that and about the issue of genocide in Australia and how you conceptualize a crime like genocide in a dispersed, decentralized settler society, in the 19th century, where there's no one state, like a totalitarian state, which is controlling everything and sending orders from above, and then its apparatus unfolds, like we associate with Nazi Germany or Stalinist Soviet Union, right? In a sense, that totalitarianism model of Holocaust is baked into people's imaginary of what a genocide looks like. But how do you fit that with a decentralized situation where there's no state on the frontier? You have settlers doing their own thing, and they're doing most of the killing without official government authorization.
Right.
Any event, so I ended up writing about that as well as the German case. So by the time I got to the University of Sydney, when I got my first job in the year 2000 and wanted to teach a class on genocide, I could see there was no textbook on genocide in Australia. I mean, there was plenty of research on frontier violence and on the issue of stolen Indigenous children, but there wasn't one book that used the word genocide. And so I ran a conference on the subject and edited a book that came out 20 years ago, Genocide and Settler Society, Frontier Violence and Stolen Indigenous Children in Australian History. And once again, at the same time, I'm also working on this book on German intellectuals in the Nazi past, which came out 3 years later. So at this moment, so we're talking about 20 years ago, I was very interested in the intellectual history of the genocide concept. Like, where does this concept come from? Obviously, it comes out of the nexus of the Second World War, because Raphael Lemkin, the Polish-Jewish lawyer who coined the concept in the early 40s, it was published then in a book in late 1944, was thinking of the Nazi occupation of East Central Europe. The book was called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And how could that be relevant for Indigenous struggles? Because I was interested in the struggles of my Indigenous colleagues at the University of Sydney, who I got to know and who were very welcoming to me, and in some ways coached me intellectually. They introduced me to literature which I didn't know about. I'd had a very Eurocentric education at UC Berkeley, a very good one, mind you, but it was very focused on German intellectual history, European historiography, and so forth. And so, I re-educated myself in a canon of indigenous studies and also the francophone black radical tradition from Césaire, Fanon, and so forth, which I was aware of, but I hadn't really sat down and digested seriously. So that led to a series of publications and conferences and so forth on genocide and colonialism, this nexus. So, political scientists call, when the process of wanting to adapt a concept for a new phenomenon, they call it conceptual stretching. So I wanted to stretch the genocide concept so that it could encompass indigenous cases and not just these cases in Europe or the Armenian genocide, which are very much top-down authoritarian models of how a state works. Now, I saw, though, after several years that I hit a roadblock because consistently people would say, what's happened in Australia, America, and so forth was terrible. That's not a genocide. The Holocaust is a genocide. That's the gold standard. That's the ideal type. That's the archetype. So, and they wouldn't budge. It doesn't matter what arguments are made about genocide being, involving settler processes, because Lemkin talked about them himself. They wouldn't budge. And I could see that in the public imagination, and also among many colleagues, the Holocaust was locked in as the archetype of genocide. And so if you couldn't analogize with the Holocaust, then you couldn't make a case that it was genocide. And the closer that I looked, I saw that this was not just a matter of the public imagination. I saw that the concept of the concept of the Holocaust, or the imaginary of the Holocaust being an attack on a defenseless racial, national, or ethnical population for no other reason that they are disliked or hated, was baked into the concept of genocide. It was in the concept. It wasn't just something, the imagination of the general public. So for the last 15 years or so, I've been working on this book, The Problems of Genocide, which tells a story of how we got to that and that conceptual link between Holocaust and genocide. One being a specific notion, it's like one event in world history. Genocide being a generic motion, which is a term Lemkin used himself. Generic means it applies to everywhere. In any event, so that's where I am at the moment. I'm trying to problematize or expose the concept and law of genocide to see its limitations. And it helps us understand, although this book was conceived over the last 15 years and published in early 2021, it helps us, I believe, understand why there's so much confusion and wrangling over the issue of what's happened in Palestine, Gaza in the last 13 months, which we'll get to later in our discussion, I'm sure. So there we go. There's a lot on the table for you.
That was an amazing sort of, you gave me the gamut from the beginning to now. You brought us up, and it was fantastic. So many threads to pull on there, because so your focus on what you called like the language of transgression, I think is so good. I think in the intro to this, I'll just read the very first paragraph of The Problems of Genocide, because you lay it out so perfectly there. So I'll put it this way, actually, like the last video I did before this one was right before the election, and I called it Genocide and the Single Issue Voter. And it was about the trolley problem ethics of voting for Trump or Kamala or whatever it was. And I used the word genocide. And frankly, I've been hesitant to use it for the last year. And I would always get comments in my videos being like, what you mean is genocide? I would say massacre. I would dance around it a little bit. And it was precisely because I'm aware of this confusion. I'm aware of this emotional landmine. It's become, as your book in the title, your book is called The Problems of Genocide, and you don't put quotes around the word genocide, but it almost is. It's almost like the problem of the language. The word genocide has become such a problem. You've laid out a little bit of it there, and I want to you could talk a little bit more about why you think it's so problematic legally, but also as this potentially, the uniqueness of the Holocaust as what we mean by genocide, and in some people's mind, the only genocide. I mean, I come from a family of Jews where that word genocide is just, it's an allergy. It's like you could call it anything else other than that. And your book is so good at at pointing out why that's a problem. So
can I ask you a question about that? Yeah. Well, I'll ask the question now. But I'm fascinated. So, because I didn't grow up in the same family environment you did. So as I said before, the Holocaust is a punctual, specific event in particular. And genocide is the universal. It's a generic concept. It can apply, conceivably everywhere, right? So in the environment you grew up, was there a sense that there was only one genocide, the Holocaust, or that there might be one or two others, Armenia or Rwanda?
I feel like it was interchangeable. It was like if we said genocide, we were talking about the Holocaust. If we said, and those, you barely learned about anything else. I think you might be okay referencing other things out there. But and then just as to throw one more thing on your plate of how the word has just become so generically the crime of crimes and maybe is losing all meaning in a way that also is problematic, not just for the reasons I know you're going to talk about, the problematic reasons, where like in a previous essay I did, I talked about abortion. Clearly I'm pro-choice and some of my listeners aren't. And I would get some comments being like, you're against genocide, but you're for the genocide of unborn babies or something. And it's like, listen, you could disagree with me on abortion, but like clearly that doesn't fit any definition of genocide. Relax. It's not just a stand-in for like the worst possible thing you could think of. So in many ways, this term,
but rhetorically it has.
Rhetorically, it has, exactly.
Well, people talk about abortion Holocaust as well. The Holocaust is another one you can stick on.
Yeah. So what is really the problem? I know you know what I'm asking because I know your book. What is the problem, and how does it blind us to maybe a massive amount of civilian death that might not fit a definition? Right.
There are quite a few problems. That's why it's a plural, the problems of genocide.
Right.
I mean, the original, an original version could have been the problem of genocide. People would have thought, well, no kidding, genocide's a problem. Right?
Right.
So, what are you telling us that we don't already know? So the book, its first sentence is that obviously the problem of, mass killing, destruction of people is a problem, but so is the concept.
Yeah.
Because it confuses us. And so, I've written a history of the concept in practice, if you like, going back 500 years. Now, but what are the problems that I'm trying to write a history of, right? One of them is that you have the notion of genocide as a crime of crimes. So it's more grave than crimes against humanity, more grave than ethnic cleansing, more grave than war crimes. Now, in law, that's actually not the case. If you look at the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, there isn't this hierarchy. But in international public opinion, in people's imaginary of what evil is, genocide is definitely the crime of crimes. Now, we need to ask how and why that happened. Okay. Another issue is that genocide focuses on ethnic, racial, and religious groups as the protected group and not a civilian population more generally. Right? So, when Lemkin was devising this concept, basically as a massive hate crime, in the 1930s, leading up to his book on Axis rule in occupied Europe, there was also an intensive debate in international affairs about the next war and aerial bombing. Because they'd seen a little of that in the First World War. And, if you look at those big bombers in the Second World War, they're all being designed in the 1930s. Like, the German fighter planes, the Spitfire, all these planes were designed 10 years earlier. Okay. So, and everybody knew what was coming, and that the aerial warfare, including the bombing of cities, which started already in the Spanish Civil War, where the German Air Force, bombed Spanish cities. And, Picasso drew a famous painting, Guernica. About
I live in Madrid, so I've seen it in person, luckily enough. Yeah.
So people are well aware that enormous civilian casualties would be occasioned by the next coming war, though no one really understood the extent of it, right? And there was an aborted or unratified International Hague Convention on aerial warfare from, I think, 1923. But it never became hard law because states, they didn't want to sign on to it because they wanted to participate in this. They wanted, a large air force that could inflict damage on the opposition. Some of the reasoning was strangely humanitarian. The idea was that First World War was awful, and there's sort of, static warfare on the Western Front, and rushing into machine guns like at the Somme, tens of thousands of people killed in a day. It went on for years. It's a grinding battle. This is a disaster. Whereas if we can knock out the enemy's factories, its capital, including many of its civilians, in one clean hit, clean in inverted commas, overnight, and end the war, that's actually more humane. in a weird way. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, yeah.
So there was that-
Consequentialism is a hell of a drug. Anyway.
yeah, that kind of reasoning was floating around in the 1920s and 30s as well. Now, in other words, but enormous civilian casualties were entailed, but they're not motivated by the intent to destroy an ethnic, racial, or religious group. It's not a hate crime in that sense. It's driven by military logic, although civilians are killed. So Lemkin had no interest in this debate. He took no notice of it. And so anyway, he goes down his own track of protecting ethnic, racial, or religious groups. He's thinking of the Armenian genocide, although he didn't use that term, obviously, until he invented it. But, that the consciousness of what had happened to the Armenians was circulating through Europe in the 20s and 30s. Everybody was aware of it, okay? They used words like massacre, deportation, extermination, and so forth, before this word genocide existed. And in fact, even Jewish groups would refer to the fate of the Armenians to interpret their own experience until about 1941. People have done research on this. Wolf Kuhner at USC has written about this. It's very interesting because then during 1941, when the Holocaust gets going, people think, oh, this is something different and new, and more extensive. Okay, and then a new vocabulary develops over the next few years. Often within Yiddish, like Churban, Holocaust itself has various etymological roots and so forth. So for various reasons, which we can also discuss, Holocaust and genocide break through after the Second World War and become the metaphors for the absolute evil, capital A, capital E. And once you're dealing with notions of the absolute, you're dealing here with almost religious notions of religious energies, which are completely understandable. I don't say this as any criticism, but as an observation. I mean, when you really try to think about what happened in the Holocaust, and you think about people marching into gas chambers, or the children and so forth, it's unbearable. And it would be even more unbearable if that's your own family, or you can imagine it's your own family. Okay, and this leaves a deposit in an intellectual culture, the intellectual framework of any political culture, any academic or any religious culture. And then it's going to take decades to digest this, or it gets sedimented in different ways. And the language of Holocaust and genocide is one of those manifestations, right? So it's always going to be catastrophic. I mean, how could it not be? Right. So it's natural that people will analogize, especially Jewish people, whether in Israel or elsewhere, will analogize current experiences, say, the 7th of October with what happened with the Holocaust, right? Now, that, as Naomi Klein wrote in a terrific article in The Guardian a few months ago, that can also be weaponized. Okay? You need to separate, there's authentic mourning and sort of a natural grabbing for analogies or recourse to analogies. Then there's states which instrumentalize and weaponize this to sort of whip up public mourning and to generate or mobilize a population for continuous warfare and to destroy an entire area known as Gaza. Right? It's an entirely different matter. In any event, the concept of genocide and Holocaust breakthrough is the absolute evil after the Second World War, for various reasons, which we can discuss, but they're irreducibly ethnic. The protected groups are ethnic, racial, or religious groups, not civilian populations as such. They're protected by the Geneva Conventions, okay, which is, and the notion of crimes against humanity. It's about, widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population in the course of armed conflict. Now, but that hasn't broken through in our imaginations the crime of crimes. Right. It's beneath genocide. Maybe not in the legal world, but for everyone else, crimes against humanity doesn't have that stigmatic aura. Like it wouldn't have if your family mentioned, a crime against humanity, it wouldn't have had the same effect. It sounds like it's genocide. Now, that's fascinating. Like, how and why did that develop? Okay. Now, I think it's because the notion of genocide is connected to Holocaust. It's its archetype, because when Lemkin invented this concept, it wasn't just for the Holocaust, but it was mainly, it was principally about the Jewish experience, but also about Polish, Czech, and Slovak experiences, which we can talk about. And that's what the delegates to the United Nations in 1947 and 48 were thinking of. They were thinking of what we now know as a Holocaust when they were trying to codify Lemkin's notion of genocide into international law, which very much minimized his very broad conception of genocide, which we might want to talk about as well. And that has then become, over the last 70 years or so, the gold standard of, what the absolute evil is, the intent to destroy an ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. And, that is the most evil thing that a state or a party can do. And that's why people like, who are critical of the Palestinian position like to ascribe genocide to Hamas. But then they say, on the Israeli side, we're engaging in armed conflict, legitimate self-defense. Okay, so that's not genocide. What they did is genocide. Although, and this is the perversion or the perverse outcome of this conceptual distinction between armed conflict or warfare and genocide, on the other hand, is that you can kill 40, 50 times more than they killed you, but you can say that's legitimate. It's just collateral damage and legitimate armed conflict. They're the ones with the genocidal intent. This is fetish of genocidal intent, though the outcomes are far less in this case than the quote unquote self-defense. Now, so I think the current conflict bears out the problems of genocide.
Yeah.
There was a tweet a couple of days ago, by the way, I'm going to share with you all.
Yeah.
Listeners, by Fania Oz-Salzberger, who's a major academic in Israel and one of the liberals. And whom I've met on several occasions. And she tweeted on the 18th, Israel is conducting a dirty, ugly, criminal war in Gaza, but not a genocide. She said Hamas's genocide of the Jews on the 7th of October, that was a genocide.
Yeah.
So she's prepared to concede an ugly, dirty, criminal war, but not a genocide. So
yeah. There's two pieces that I want to ask about so you're laying out this case just so my audience is clear that, and maybe this isn't Lemkin's fault, he's describing a phenomena that does happen where, for whatever reason of hatred and hysteria we could talk about, an ethnic group is targeted and can be exterminated, and then also the aesthetics of them being unarmed and shuffled into to trains or something is quite an interesting visual that you're right that has become sort of cemented in our minds. Or even the Armenian one, it was a little bit earlier, so there's not as much photographic evidence, but the stories of that one are like, I'll tell a horrible one, cover your ears if you're sensitive. Is, they would tie families together by their hands and then just shoot one of them and push that one, the heaviest one, into a pit or into the water, so they would all die and drown, because then you just need to waste one bullet. I mean, some of the most horrible, like reading it is bad enough. Seeing it was cameras were much less around in the year 1901-ish or whenever those things were happening.
Well, it's during the First World War. There are iconic pictures of related to the Armenian genocide. It's of women and children, old men marching into the desert. Mass expulsion. So where they mainly perished.
First World War versus Second World War, you get more photographic evidence anyway. Yes. But that, so it is a phenomenon that happens. But it also seems when you're asking those questions in your upbringing or maybe mine in America with the Native American, is it a genocide, is it not? It's this settler violence thing, like, does it fit this thing? There is something interesting about in my mind, the spectacle of like, trying to extinguish part of your own citizenry. The way the Germans are like, we don't like the Jewish Germans, so we're going to kill them. Like you cleanse your own rather than some cross-border thing, which we just call war, right? Like the Americans could go bomb villages, talk about aerial bombing in Vietnam and Cambodia and kill 2 to 3 million or whatever it was over those years. But it's like, they're not there, but we do have this other kind of ick factor about what happened to Japanese internment camps, because it's like, oh, those were American citizens, like on your own soil. So again, it's like, I think you're so right, and tell me if I'm right here. Like Lemkin didn't intend for this term to get so out of hand and risen to like the crime of crimes in an imagination. He may have been describing a phenomenon that is terrible, but was limited, or maybe not. Maybe he had other motives. I don't know the Lemkin.
He may have even come. Actually, he may have even come up with the term "crime of crimes." I have to check. But he definitely did want to monumentalize genocide, and he felt very threatened by the discourse of human rights and crimes against humanity.
Oh, interesting. Okay,
because crimes against humanity were in the indictment of the Nuremberg trials.
Right.
And he wanted genocide to be one of those indictments. Genocide is mentioned as an example of a war crime. If you look at the text of the International Military Tribunal's charter, it's called the the London Charter. And, he wrote his book too late. It came out too late for the negotiators in America, in the State Department and elsewhere, to really register what he was saying and make genocide one of the major indictments. The main one is crimes against peace, the crime of aggression, like starting the war. Then there's crimes against humanity, and then there's war crimes. So they're the three indictments or the laws that Nazi war criminals or Nazi defendants were prosecuted with. And genocide wasn't one of them. And he was devastated that genocide wasn't included as one of those articles. And he and others then pushed for it to become a convention. So if you look at the timing, Nuremberg trials of the major war criminals, they drag on when the Americans take over in 1947-48. But the major round is concluded in the fall of 1946. And a month later, the General Assembly of the United Nations passes a resolution calling for a genocide convention, which then takes 2 years to eventuate. There's endless negotiations and committee work and so forth.
And this is the one where we get the definition that's been still going around now of a partial or total.
That's been adopted by the Rome Statute. So a convention, which was then voted in the General Assembly in late 1948, it means an international treaty. So it's a law. If you sign up for that convention, you're signing up for international law. Yeah. And because it's a convention that under the auspices of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, which is the court of the United Nations, unlike the ICC, right? It's the court of the United Nations in which states sue each other, not individuals, but states. The South African can use the Genocide Convention to take Israel to court to sue them. It can't do so under the ICC Rome Statute because it's A, not a party, neither is Israel, and B, the prosecution initiative has to come from the prosecutor, not from another state. Okay, so it's a very different sort of kettle of fish. In any event, the convention is hard law, and that's one reason we're talking about it. But that's also why that definition was then imported into the instruments of the ad hoc criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s. From the mid-90s for another 10 years or so, those processes dragged on for many years. And then also into the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which was negotiated in the 1990s as well and became operative in the 2000s. So that court is very young, unlike the International Court of Justice. But it's only very recently, in the last 25 years or so, that the International Court of Justice has begun hearing genocide cases. Firstly, because of the Yugoslav Balkan conflict, Croatia and Serbia and so forth. And then Myanmar more recently, and now Palestine. So this is a very dynamic legal situation. It's quite open in many ways, and that's why people are trying to convince the judges at the ICJ that genocide is taking place in Gaza or not taking place. Right. So people are drawing on the jurisprudence which has been evolving over the last 30 years, but it's in a process of evolution, and many are hoping that it's not set in stone. Although lawyers and judges are very conservative, they like to follow precedents, right? But they're hoping to convince the judges that what you're seeing in Gaza is not only an armed conflict, which it clearly is or was, even if grossly asymmetrical, but that genocidal logics are also in play. And to go back to a previous thread, this tension or contrast between an intention to destroy, which is genocide, or an intention to defeat, which is an armed conflict, is at issue. And what they make sense conceptually. They just one is to destroy, one is to defeat. But if you look in practice, and this goes back to the air warfare issue we were talking about before, including in Vietnam, right? But also in North Korea in the early 50s, where 2 million North Koreans died because of carpet bombing by American forces. In practice, groups are destroyed, or in whole or in part, by armed conflict, and it's not just incidental. Like when you're carpet bombing entire cities, do you think it's accidental that all these civilians die? No, clearly it's not unintentional. But nor is it exactly the same as the logic of the Holocaust, right? There are overlaps as well as distinctions. It's messy, right? But the law doesn't like dealing with its messiness.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's one of the problems. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is to sort of see how we got this messiness, and to try to sort of pull it apart, but also accept that genocidal and military logics are fused and run together. And we're seeing that in Gaza, because you have lots of, and also in other, also in Ukraine, but not to fixate on the Gaza case, but there's endless quotations from Russian authorities as well as Israeli authorities, which evince an intention to destroy this group or state, in the case of Ukraine, in whole or in part. They're slightly different. I've not heard anyone say that all Ukrainians are animals and should be destroyed, but there are quotes that these are fascists. They need to be denazified. We need to destroy their state. We need to end this fake ethnicity or nationality of Ukrainianness, and because they're really Russians. It's like, you don't hear that from Israelis. They're not trying to turn Palestinians into Israelis, right? They want to expel them. So there are differences, but the sort of utter contempt of the other side and the intent to destroy their sense of groupness in whole or in part in different ways is pretty obvious.
Yeah.
And even apologists for those states say, well, yeah, we see these quotes, but no one meant them seriously, or these were just in the
rhetoric,
they were just rhetoric, or they were meant in the they were uttered in the height of emotional state, soon after the 7th of October. If you look at our generals and the operational orders in Gaza, these are like sober men of reason, and they're obeying international law.
Yeah. So on that, because you introduced it, and we're tiptoeing around because I want to get to it. Your proposed solution with permanent security as a concept and term. But before that, it's because you sort of introduced this complication of this like dual intent or mixed intent. Amnesty International just put out their report basically coming to the conclusion that this was a genocide. And if I'm not mistaken, the way I was reading it, I'm talking about Israel and Gaza, of course, now. If I'm not mistaken, when I was reading it, they basically saw what you see, and most scholars see, that there is this problem of dual intent, where basically, if I can say, hey, I have a military objective here, this is just collateral damage, like, I don't know, defeating communism is a military objective, so exactly. 2 million North Koreans have to die in the process. It's like, but even if I have some other intent in there being like, yeah, well, the ethnic group I'm not a big fan of either, but there's a military, like the dual intent, actually legally for a very strict legal judge might be like, well, then it actually doesn't qualify as genocide.
That's the issue.
Yeah, that's the issue that you're
and
coming
the lawyers
to there.
are arguing about that right now.
And then but if you can just go through, because you've done it before, maybe expose the kind, like, what was the term you came with, like stretching before, like
conceptual stretching
that's happening in a very perverse way of the IDF and the Israeli generals are not dummies, and they know how to stretch this term, and they can weaponize that. Hey, we can wiggle out of being called a genocide using this with something like the "Where's Daddy" plus a 2,000 bomb thing. Going, if you could just walk through that, the absurdities for us humans who are like, how do we just stop this destruction? Who cares what we call it? Is like maddening.
My view. My view is that the sort of the way that the concept of genocide is not a natural concept. It's like something that was invented, during the Second World War, and then for various contingent reasons, it became a law. In part because the Nuremberg trials were unsatisfactory in the way they limited the operation of crimes against humanity. They didn't allow it to be applied in peacetime.
Can I also, as you're answering this though, because I know, and I just want to hear if it's in there, you suspect there's a bit of a nefarious game being played here because of who gets to write, and like who's in charge of the UN at this time and who gets to write these things. There was certainly an incentive to make genocide the crime of crimes and then be so limited that you would never end up committing it, and it really would never get in your way.
I mean, I think this is a common view among scholars now who've studied this, and there's a book by Adam Weisevent, for example, as a scholar in Norway, on the Soviet Union and its role in the gutting of the Genocide Convention. So he's read the Soviet sources. where the Soviets didn't want a concept of genocide that included political groups.
Right, because
because for
yeah.
obvious reasons they've been like massacring and incarcerating, deporting, what they regarded as counter-revolutionary groups within their own polity, and they wanted to limit the concept of genocide so it would apply only to what they call fascism, Nazism, racism.
Yeah.
I think words to that effect.
And
so
we certainly don't want terrorist groups included in this or anyone who harbors them. It's like, just carve out whoever you want. Yeah,
exactly. And on these sort of UN committees that were thrashing out the definitions in 1947 and 48, there were two draft conventions, and people kind of peeled off bits and pieces of it. They're very inclusive drafts, and the idea was like in sculpting, like you carve off bits and you end up with a beautiful sculpture. So on these committees, the Soviets were often backed by anti-communist South American regimes or Latin American countries that didn't want political groups in there either, so that they could persecute communists.
Right. Yeah.
So you had this communist uprising, be able to suppress insurgencies. They didn't want, any of the states didn't want a genocide concept or law that would preclude them from viciously and vigorously suppressing rebellions, uprisings, insurgencies. Now, it's those circumstances since the Second World War that have been producing most of the second. Look at the Uyghurs in China, Darfur and Sudan, the Myanmar with the Rohingya. These are all cases of separatism. Also, Bangladesh becoming an independent state in 1971. It was East Pakistan. What genocide was alleged at the time. Also, the Biafra case in Nigeria in the late 60s was also a secessionist conflict. These are all cases of states, relatively new states, which have peoples locked in them, some of whom want to create a separate state, separatism, secession. Okay, and there's an uprising, an insurgency, and then it's viciously put down by the respective governments in different ways. So in Myanmar, there's a mass expulsion, which is very much murderous and very much resembles the Armenian genocide and the Nakba.
Yeah.
Okay? But in China, you have a mass incarceration in Xinjiang province by the Chinese state, to reduce the birth rate, to contain this population, and to de-Islamicize it. So they very much use the war on terror. So it's not expulsion, it's incarceration. So each state does it in a slightly different way. Now, genocide has been alleged in all these cases. In some cases, or instances like in Myanmar, there's a legal case now running at the ICJ. The Uyghur advocates have been saying this is genocide. Pompeo, when he was Secretary of State, said this is genocide because the US wanted to squeeze China for diplomatic reasons. But the major NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch talked about crimes against humanity. They didn't see genocide here. And what I'm interested in is less this pinning a tail on the donkey, which is what lawyers do, right? Is to understand what is the strategic logic that the states are engaged in. Okay, and that's to get back to your question about permanent security. That's what I think they're doing. They are they were faced with a choice. There were little insurgencies in these cases, by the way. Now they had a choice to confront the insurgents. Several hundred people in the end. It's not that many, right? And put them away. And any state is entitled to do that. That would have been, in a sense, a regular security operation, right? But they decided to deal with the possibility of secession, separatism, rebellion in the future in a once and for all manner by confronting, through deportation or through incarceration, the entire minority population from which the insurgents stemmed. So it's that fish in the water analogy that Mao taught. The insurgents are the fish, but they need a sea to swim in. So you need to drain the sea or the swamp. Okay. And that means you're attacking innocent women and children preemptively. There's this logic of preemption in permanent security. And I think that's the logic that's driving the Soviets or the Russians, and also the Israelis. Now, in many of those cases, you can't pin the genocide concept on it so neatly. Yeah. Other crimes are picked up, war crimes, crimes against humanity. But people fixate on the genocide concept. So instead of trying to understand, what are the Israelis and Russians up to here, or the Chinese, or the Myanmar, or the Sudanese state under Bashir, and then understand that, in a sense, in a social, scientific, strategic manner, right? And then we can think about the law. But
Yeah.
they're kind of different realms. Okay, the law, these legal concepts are artificial constructs of diplomats and international lawyers. They're not real things. Okay, of course, the violence is real, but the sort of the intentions and strategies embedded in those laws and concepts don't necessarily reflect empirical reality. Now, if we look at what's happening in Gaza, we can see that the Israelis are going to annex the north, as they are going to annex Area C. They're going to in the West Bank. They're expelling all the Palestinians from there into the south and into little enclaves, but there are also military zones dividing them. We know from an article in Haaretz 2 days ago that anyone who ventures into a military zone, which they don't know about, incidentally, there are no fences or anywhere, will just get shot, including children. And there's also exaltation in each sniping shot, as reported in. So it's very ugly, as reported in this Israeli newspaper, and that you have all that AI business that you mentioned before, Jay, where there is a target list which is generated by cell phone usage, because the cell phone network in Gaza is run by the Israelis, and they think they know who owns the phones, and they think that phone X is owned by a Hamas member, and so when he comes out of a tunnel or wherever he is, they see it come up on in their radar or in their network, and they wait for him. It's always a male to get home. Then they drop the bomb on the home and everyone in it dies with them. That's why we have so many women and children killed. And it's quite a deliberate targeting. It's the opposite of human shielding. They're waiting till the object or the subject of interest gets into the building, and then they drop it. So I don't know why people are still talking about the human shields argument. I think it's been knocked on the head empirically. Okay.
So
it's not. But once again, it's not a, if you like, a pure genocidal intention,
right?
And it's not carpet bombing, although the result looks like carpet bombing. Each one of these buildings was at least so far as we can tell, was in a sense putatively a military objective. But there was a wanton and calculated acceptance of massive civilian casualties, way beyond any proportionate manner, which would qualify as war crimes for each one of those. Now, as Martin Shaw, the international relations and genocide scholar in the UK, has pointed out, individually, each of these may be a war crime. But, you've got tens of thousands of these now over, little dots. You can see it on the map from Forensic Architecture that issued a report on the cartography of genocide. 80% of Gaza is now covered, if you like, from that map with little dots, each representing an airstrike or a bomb of some kind, in which these 40, 50,000 people have killed, many more people buried. But each may be a war crime, but you have to individually investigate those, which no one's ever going to do. But you also need to get in there, and no crime scene investigator will be allowed in by the Israelis. But cumulatively, if you take it together, the effect is genocidal. It's the destruction of Gaza. And Israeli leaders are talking like that. We're not. They do say, look, we're targeting Hamas, but often they say, Gaza will be bombed to the Stone Age. This is the end of Gaza and the end of this refugee camp, that refugee camp. They're talking about spaces and the people who occupy it as a whole. And so there's this fusion of military and genocidal logics. It's destruction of a space and many of the people in it, in the interests of the permanent security of Israel. So you can see that's where, to come back to the permanent security, it is accompanied by plenty of racism, but we know that the racism was there before and led to, the containment of Gaza and even the funding of Hamas, so they would keep it. Qatar sent the money, right? And the Israelis let it in, right? It's an open secret now. It's not even a secret. But the idea was that we could just set and forget and occasionally mow the lawn, to use that terrible analogy. But now they're pulling up the roots. Okay? And, that's where we're getting into, if you like, genocidal territory. But, they may or may not be able to escape at the International Court of Justice when it hears the merits of the case in a year or two or three. I mean, these things drag on for years, right? Yeah. But, but if we step back, we can see the strategic logic is one of permanent security. And just to make clear to your listeners and viewers, permanent security is a deeply sinister and I would say criminal intention, because no state or individual has the right to absolute safety. You have to live with your neighbors. I mean, to use an analogy with individuals, if you're paranoid, you could walk down the street, you could be looking for anyone who could threaten you, right? But if you're thinking in sort of terms of absolute safety, you would preemptively go and take out people who you think might be threatening in the future. And that's what permanent security does, okay? So, Hamas clearly are guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity on the 7th of October, no question, right? But they were, what did they say, 40,000 of them?
Whatever the
whatever,
count
right?
is. Yeah.
But there are 2 million people living there. They're innocent. They're innocent, but we're hearing a lot of collective guilt language. I saw a major Russian chess player on Twitter the other day, who's a big supporter of Ukraine, mind you, he's very anti-Putin. He called Palestinians in Gaza a collaborating population.
Yeah.
And you see that kind of language a lot. Now that leads to a collective guilt ascription or imputation, and therefore the killability of this population. It's genocidal language.
I mean, I love it. I think it's brilliant. And so if I get it right, because everyone focuses on intent and mindset as some sort of standard that you have to prove for this genocidal intent or whatever, I like replacing that with a permanent security mindset. It's almost counterintuitive. It's why it's kind of a cool book to pull as being the problem.
Well, because states think, the get out of jail card for states or authorities is that we had to do this for security. That's the role of a state is, among other things, is to secure its population, to keep them secure, right? There's food security, all kinds of securities, which are warm and fuzzy things. Okay, but if you take the state on its own ground and say that is not actually what you're doing, this is not a legitimate security pretext or security reasoning. What you're doing in Gaza now, it may have been for a week in the middle of October to confront Hamas and to stop them sending missiles, right? And the ICJ would not get in the way, and nor would the ICC, right? As long as the response is proportionate. But what's been happening since then far exceeds confronting an immediate security threat. They're engaged in an operation to prevent future security threat. And that means destroying an entire population.
Yeah.
So
sorry, I was going to say, just to be really perverse.
Yeah.
My probably most popular essay that I did was called "Do You Condemn Hamas?" And in the middle of it, I showed this 12-year-old boy named Nemr who had been shot, and people can watch it. It was Middle East Eye filmed it, and he's showing the wounds to the cameraman and saying, "I'm waiting to grow up so I can become a fighter, so I can step on his head like he stepped mine and stomp him." And he's crying more and more as he says it. It's a horrible video to watch because you could feel him not wanting to go down that path, but going down that path. And I didn't get any of these responses, but there are many Israelis who see that being like, oh, we should have got him too, for exactly the mindset that you're preventing, being like, oh, he's saying he's just waiting to come kill us in 5 years. We should have got him too. And then the logic of where's daddy and everything else. And you do hear that rhetoric from them. So I think that's brilliant to like kind of set the genocide phenomenon aside a little bit as a limited, interesting phenomenon, and focus on that. I mean, it almost reminded me when you were laying it out there of like the George Zimmerman and what was the boy with the hood? Gosh, I forgot the black boy that he killed years ago now.
Florida.
Yeah, in Florida, he was just being careful and watching the neighborhood, and it's a stand your ground state in Florida, and killed this boy, and was acquitted. And then many people were like, "Are you sure there wasn't always also a racist intent involved in there?" But courts, especially when laws are written in such a limited way, are so tied. I mean, for people. So to also let you know, I did a film about the Jessup Cup, the ICJ moot court competition. I don't know if you know it, that was my introduction. It's the largest moot court competition in the world for law students around the world. I think 100 countries participated in it. It's every year. It's like the American Idol for law students, and they go. That's my introduction to the ICJ. But I was steeped in legal language at all of these levels, and for people who follow the courts, I wasn't shocked by that. by that. So I was gonna ask you about that a little bit. I mean, I think you're making a really good case that probably there's way too much focus hanging on even that ICJ case about genocide, and maybe you worry about that because I don't know if you had to guess now where you would be like 50-50 where they're going to go, which says nothing about how much clearly you're horrified by what's happening there, and I think it's rather a problem from all kinds of angles, as do I. But we're hanging so much maybe on this like spectacle of a courtroom, and that decides what really happened, and that's all that matters.
It's years down the track, so it's not going to rescue anyone. I mean, in the meantime, you've got an advisory opinion on the occupation from July on the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories from July, which should be getting more airplay because it says it's illegal, and all states of the world should press Israel to stop, to get out. That's what should be happening. But in fact, more arms are being shifted to Israel by the US and Germany and so forth. So there are many fronts in this, or balls in the air on this topic. I mean, I'm very hopeful that the ICJ does, in a sense, make its thinking about genocide in relation to military intent and this fusion a little more self-reflective.
Right.
So this is an opportunity for them. Now, the international lawyers I've been speaking with and have published in the Journal the Journal of Genocide Research, think that the jurisprudence is there for the ICJ to do that. It's just some minor. It all depends really on the temperament of particular judges and who's up at the time. Some would refuse to go down that track, and others might. Okay?
So just to spell it
out, it's a dynamic
space. They could say there might be dual intents here. It's still a genocide.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's an online journal called Just Security where the editor Adil Haq argued that the jurisprudence allows the recognition that there are dual intents, and then you've got a refutation or an attempted refutation of that by two Israeli scholars. So this is an ongoing debate among international lawyers, and it gets very technical and so forth. But as my sort of somewhat more amateur reading of this is that so far the courts have been, on the restrictive side. For example, with the Bosnia case where Srebrenica is recognized as a genocide, but that was one from 1995. That was one massacre among many others. I mean, if you'd had a recognition that war and genocidal logics run together, you could have had the proposition that many more instances in that conflict were genocide, and not just one. Okay, because the other victims are forgotten, whereas the victims, the Bosnian victims of Srebrenica, are not forgotten. They're remembered and commemorated, and the other victims sometimes feel, well, why isn't there government resources devoted to a large gravesite and memorials and so forth? I mean, there are material dimensions to this, as well as the symbolic capital of saying, we suffered a genocide in this case. So the states have been reluctant, and ICJ judges have followed suit in criminalizing it with the concept of genocide, aspects of military conduct, because states like, if necessary, to engage in military conduct in what they think of as self-defense.
Yeah.
And they don't want to be hauled before an international court. So that's why the states defined genocide so narrowly in 1948.
Yeah.
And they didn't, by the way, to go back to your previous statement, they didn't elevate it into the crime of crimes in 1948. That was a cultural process, political process that took decades to unfold. I think it's got a lot to do, and it's not intentional in a sense. I'm not arguing there's a conspiracy. It's just the way things played out. But Holocaust memory was something that only develops in the 60s, and then in fitful, starting, stopping, and then really breaks through in the 80s and the 90s. I mean, that's 50 years after the event, and the prestige, if you like, of genocide grows with it. They're fused. Right? Yeah. There wasn't a field of genocide studies in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it really only starts developing again in the 1990s with a handful of scholars. The journal I edit was only founded in 1999, the Journal of Genocide Research, and its founding editor, Henry Hattenbach, who also taught at City College, where I am, he passed away only this year, along with Yehuda Bauer and Israel Chani, who were, all founders of field of Holocaust and genocide studies, over the years. So there's a sort of shifting of generations right now. But this is all fairly new if you look at it in the long term.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of fascinating, trying to ask this as carefully as I can, of the necessity or the usefulness. Again, it's hard not to be conspiratorial here with this, but the necessity of elevating the Holocaust and making that the textbook genocide, and that fusing, which you're saying kind of happened post 48 up until the 90s, with the dreams and the vision of Zionism, and maybe to get preemptively ahead of what they may have suspected that they were going to be faced with. Like, even just, I said, the spectacle of it, without being legal scholars, there is this feeling of like, if Germans are going after their own Jews and they're crying for help, they're unprotected because they don't have a state, they don't have a military.
Yeah.
There's just vulnerable citizens now being killed because of their ethnicity. If Israel, there's always this like back and forth. If Israel just annexed the whole thing and said, screw it, it's all ours, then you're suddenly faced with like, cool, is this actually an apartheid now because those people live there? Are you going to grant them citizenship?
Yeah.
And if not, and I guess it kind of, I've always just been daring them to do it and being like, go ahead and do it. Obviously, if you clear the land like they have in Gaza and then do it, it's meaningless. But it's like the intent that you don't want
it's going to happen.
People.
It's going to happen in Area C, and which is most of the West Bank.
Yeah,
most of the West Bank.
Yeah,
so it's the same
then
playbook.
Play that out. Yeah,
well, it's the same playbook in Gaza as in, though it's in slow motion in the West Bank, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
So the idea is to push Palestinians to ever smaller enclaves and to settle and dominate the rest of the territory. And unlike 1948, 1967, we can't shift them across the borders because the borders are closed.
Yeah.
Okay. And certainly Jordan doesn't want Palestinian refugees. Neither does Egypt. Okay. Yeah. So the scenario is different. So there's a containment issue. And it's a bit more like the Chinese logic in Xinjiang province. You contain an unruly population, in that case, Uyghurs, both Muslim populations, incidentally, in ever smaller places, and then you colonize the rest. Now, it's not a final solution. I don't mean that in any Holocaust analogy, because ultimately, the idea is to get rid of all the Palestinians, right? But the logic is, let's get this is an historic opportunity that Hamas gave us with their horrible miscalculation and crimes on the 7th of October. It gives us the cover to grab more Palestinian land. Yeah. And the Americans and the Europeans will not get in the way because of what happened on the 7th of October, okay? And so I don't need to elaborate that because your viewers and readers know.
Yeah.
So we're going to confine Palestinians into ever smaller territory. We don't care what the conditions are. Let the international community wring its hands about that. That's their problem. Even though we're the occupying power and we're legally responsible for the welfare of the civilian population. But we'll deal with those enclaves next time there's a crisis. We're dealing with people who think in terms of sacred time. Like, we're reestablishing a state after thousands of years of exile. So, we'll see the Americans off. We'll just wait for the next president. We'll see off the Europeans. They're a pest. If we have to withdraw our embassy from Ireland, who cares, right? Yeah. What matters is that we're on our historic biblical territory. We'll even slice off some of Syria, and for putatively security purposes, and greater Israel will grow and grow. Each crisis every 40, 50 years gives us an opportunity. Yeah. It doesn't shrink; it gets bigger. Okay. Now the Russians are thinking in similar terms in relation to Ukraine. Like Putin thought this was an historic mistake that Ukraine even exists. That goes. That's why he's constantly critical of Lenin, and then also various other Soviet leaders later in the peace who granted, Crimea to Ukraine and so forth. And they're rectifying an historical mistake, as far as the Russian political class is concerned. And the stakes are so high on, these symbolic national identity grounds, but also security grounds, because they don't want a Western pro-state border closer to Moscow, with missiles planted on the border, is so high, they're willing to suffer enormous consequences, enormous casualties, and to wait out the West. I mean, one American general said, "We'll use, if I recall, we'll use Ukraine, will bleed out Russia." Words to that effect, right? It's happened the other way around.
Yeah.
It's the other way around. And unfortunately, the people who are suffering are Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Terrible.
Gosh.
Now, to get back to your issue earlier, I mean, I know I'm sort of opening
No. It's fantastic.
many building sites here, is that, I do want to emphasize to readers, I don't believe in historical conspiracies, and no one's sitting in a room saying, let's emphasize Holocaust memory so to cover Israel. But it certainly worked out that way.
Yeah.
And, there are heated debates among Holocaust scholars, many of whom are Israeli, about this. Some are doubling down, others are jumping ship and saying this is not what I signed up for. Holocaust memory was to be to have the function of never again for everyone and not just for us. Okay, so these are ongoing debates. A cultural history, a cultural historical approach would trace how and why Holocaust memory evolved, and then how it was articulated and pushed in different institutional locations. For example, the European Union, the European Parliament passes resolutions, gives money to institutions to fund Holocaust education. UNESCO has a Holocaust education program, which is global now. So you can see where it's being promoted, and also the message. Is the message an anti-racist one, or is it one that prioritizes only anti-Semitism? As something that should be opposed. So you have to look at the detail, and once again, you'll find different kinds of messages there.
I was going to ask you about this. I mean, just because we're on it. Is that thing you sent me, that journal, that's public? Because I want my readers to read it if they can. That thing
sure. It's behind a paywall, but I sent it to you. I'll send you the link, and then you can.
Maybe I can.
But it will become off the paywall next month.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe people will earmark it. But because I was going to ask you about how comfortable you are speaking about this kind of stuff in academia, because it's I think in that article you sent me, calling something Holocaust and genocide studies is already kind of funny. Everyone's like, isn't that just saying cucumber and vegetable studies? Why are we isolating the Holocaust, which has become, because what you just said, why Holocaust memory evolves the way it does, it's a very, you're touching a landmine when you say, well, you could also weaponize that to commit your own atrocities. So, how comfortable are you as an academic or a scholar, someone who has a job? I don't know, I've been out of university for quite a long time, but when I was there, this was all pre-October 7th. I was the very small lone voice worrying about, gosh, you're sure saying the word anti-Semitism a lot, and are you sure you're not abusing it and putting some sort of force field around this state, which I had major problems with as a young teenager. They weren't articulated yet, and it seems like the proverbial S is hitting the fan when it comes to that question, and maybe academia, the article was, will genocide studies survive this question? And so it's really there.
Just so your viewers and listeners know, we're talking about an article in Jewish Currents that came out today. Is today the 20th?
Well, I'll put this out maybe after Christmas, so whatever.
That came out in December. By Marie Cohen, which is an investigation over many months. I interviewed her, I think maybe 10 months ago, or she interviewed me. And to talk about the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, but mainly genocide studies, because they're overlapping separate fields, about how the 7th of October and the consequent campaign by the Israelis has split the field and confused the field, because many of these Holocaust and genocide studies centers at universities issued condemnations of Hamas, but have not said anything since. They've not issued condemnations of Israel, although it's killed 50 times more people, 40 times more people, and destroyed an entire landscape and made it unlivable for human habitation. So, empirically far worse, right? Why is that the case? Now, Marie Cohen gets into the politics of, donors who threaten to pull their money from centers should they go down this path of condemning what Israel's doing or calling it genocide. And, she interviewed people who were affected by that, people who lost their jobs or had job offers withdrawn because they said Israel was committing a textbook case of genocide, as Raz Siegel did in also in the journal Jewish Currents 6 days after the 7th of October. So the article also, though, goes, and I think this is equally interesting, into these conceptual issues about, what is genocide, and how is it related to armed conflict? Is this collateral damage issue one that's relevant, or is it just a pretext or a fig leaf? And she shows how, I think accurately, how it's confusing. That the premise of the field is, at sense, incoherent, because if you fixate on genocide as this sort of intention to destroy and separate it clinically from collateral damage arising from legitimate self-defense, you can argue, as Fania Salzberger did, that Israel may be waging a dirty criminal war, but it's not genocide. But what Hamas did is genocide. So that's what these centers in the field should focus on. They should focus on the criminality of genocide committed by Hamas or attempted by Hamas, but by no means call what Israel is doing genocide. Now, I'm quoted in that article by saying, if that is the outcome we lead to, then the field is dead.
Yeah, I love that quote.
Because if our imperative is human life, and is the human life of groups, nations, and peoples, then accepting this premise means that we will accept the destruction of Ukraine, the destruction of Gaza, as legitimate, or as not our business, not our business. So this is untenable. So what I'm trying to do in this book, you mentioned the problems of genocide, but also in the journal I edit, the Journal of Genocide Research, is to repair the flawed foundations of the field, in the concept of genocide, and to repoliticize it. What do I mean by that?
Yeah.
Well, one of the problems of genocide we've not talked about, we've been sort of dancing around it a bit, is that the genocide was depoliticized because the notion is that Jewish people were murdered, targeted by the Nazis solely because they were Jewish, not for anything they've done, so not for any political agency, just for being who they were. Okay, just for being Jewish was enough. So the ideal victim, or the exemplary victim, which is a term from criminology, is the defenseless, agentless Jewish civilian. Okay, they weren't engaged in an insurgency or a separatist movement, in which we've been talking about. Right? It was unlike Myanmar, unlike Xinjiang province. It's unlike the Armenian genocide, where there was agency, or at least from some of the victim group. Okay, a political agency. There was a political project to establish a separate state or something like that. Now, Jews weren't engaged in that kind of project, whether in Germany or in, most Jews lived in Poland and other parts of East Central Europe in the 1940s. So that's what's so confusing for people, is that's how people understand the Holocaust. Certainly the Nazis didn't understand that. They thought Jews were an active political threat in their paranoid, delusional mindset, right? Which we could talk about if you like, but that's how racists think. Now, the Holocaust is understood like that. Genocide is then, it's imported into the genocide concept. That's the intent to destroy a racial, ethnic, or religious group as such, just for being who they are, not for anything they've done. And so now people try to look for analogies, or try to analogize with that, with the current situation, in which there actually are political logics. So if you look at Palestine advocacy, they'll focus very much on the women and children in Gaza, who are not combatants, right? And less on the men who are or could be potential combatants, who are political actors. Right? And this distorts they don't talk much about Hamas, which is, a highly problematic terrorist national liberation movement. It is a national liberation movement. But that, once again, that doesn't mean it can't engage in criminal measures or criminal acts, which it clearly has. Totally illegal. And that's why the International Criminal Court has issued indictments for initially 3, but 2 of them are dead. The third one's probably dead. Warrants for Hamas leaders for what they did on the 7th of October.
Yeah.
Now, to repair the concept of genocide, we need to repoliticize it and understand that victims are not attacked in the minds of the perpetrator. Because it's in a crime of intent. They're not attacked just because they're different, just because you don't like them, or for racist reasons. It's because you regard them as threatening. But that does not make it legitimate. It does not make your security measures legitimate, because your threat assessments are likely delusional.
Yeah.
Right? People in Gaza are not a threat to Israel. Hamas has been defeated, right? But what they're doing now is to prevent the possibility of another 7th of October, in the future. And Israeli authorities are openly saying so. So they don't say we're going to commit genocide. No one says that, right? Because they understand the implications of it. But they will say we're going to keep our population safe. They use this legitimate language of safety. And that's what we need to problematize. And unfortunately, the way the genocide concept is developed and has been conceptualized, it doesn't allow us to get to that.
Yeah.
The states say, look, we're not engaging in this action for racial reasons. The same with the apartheid analogy, by the way. We're doing it for security. And then they think they're off the hook. Now, international lawyers quibble here. They say there's a difference between intent and motive, but I'm yet to be convinced by that.
Yeah.
Incidentally, on the apartheid thing, because I do follow this debate as well, Israeli advocates will say, okay, there is segregation on the West Bank, but it's not motivated by the intent of racial superiority,
right,
which is in the language of the convention, because that's taken from South Africa, right? It's for security reasons. Yeah. It's the same pretext.
Yeah. No, I love it. I think it's brilliant, and actually, because I want to move to this more speculative, those questions I had about sort of the legitimacy hanging by a thread, if there is, of the international legal system and the UN and its precursors of the League of Nations. But on this permanent security thing, it's so good. As you were speaking, I was thinking of like, well, the aesthetics. We're talking a bit about aesthetics of horror, right? The language of transgression, but also the aesthetics of killing. And I'm talking about like, wow, like it's very unlikely that we will see humans on trains and gas chambers again, because people that we know, like we see the picture and we're like, oh, I know what that is. But like what's happening to the Uyghurs, I did an episode actually before I went to video about that. If anyone's interested, I thought it was one of my best audio episodes where she was making a case that there was a genocide and talking about these camps. That one's probably like aesthetically, not that China lets you see much of it, probably the closest that we would see. Yeah. But it's just the aesthetics of it are problematic, and everyone kind of knows not to do the thing the last bad guys did. Exactly, change it up and hide it a little bit. But people are outraged, right? I mean, certainly the tide has turned. We live in a social media world where we see more of these horrors. And if the results of bombings and the killings and people with their cell phones, as much as Israel tries to contain the media there, Bisan with her cell phone can win an Emmy and get out to the world, changes things. But to make your pitch for permanent security even more robust, I think it holds up to future in such a way of, if that becomes significantly problematic and annoying for the states that want to continue to, enact their security by containing and killing these populations, if they can't quite outright kill them as easily because people get really upset about seeing that, well, the surveillance state and the neutralizing people and the keeping that, like the technology and the dystopian sci-fi sounding futures I'm talking about here, also fall into the purview of what you were talking about, of the crime is going for a utopian vision of permanent security, which will inevitably lead to
absolute safety.
These types of horrors, and it would totally escape the Genocide Convention, and they'd be able to do it. And there's been great work done on this, but one of Israel's biggest exports, as we know, is their surveillance technology, which tons of states around the world are buying and involved in. I know a tiny bit about how far they are ahead. This is a tiny anecdote, but I used to work for a sports visualization company that was very interested in seeing with cameras if they can track the arm movements of sports players in order to like put them into video games. And I could put up a camera and then I could put it in virtual reality and you could run next to the side of Messi. Very innocent sounding stuff. But you know what companies were far and away ahead of everyone else in that kind of technology of visualizing and trying with cameras to track limbs and stuff? Were Israeli companies, for obvious reasons, that they have cameras everywhere and they want to know if you're reaching into your bag for a bomb or a gun or whatever. Yeah. So anyway, that's just an anecdote of how far ahead they are with that stuff. But it's one more pitch for your idea of like, that's the crime. That's the mentality that leads to the crimes. Let's put it that way. Yeah. I don't know if I just answered everything you could answer, if you have anything to add, but if not, I'll just, because I want to ask about sort of what we're definitely laying out. And I think obviously we agree that the international legal structures are rippling with problems that are being exploited for awful ends, and maybe people's patience with it is running out. And if 3 years from now the ICJ is like, you know what, we can't rule it as a genocide, or even if it's a close vote or whatever, you're going to get this awful "I told you so" moment, or the other way around. And people make so much of this thing. But even if you get it, let's say they say, hey, it's a genocide, even if it's been ceasefire for 3 years or something, or 2 years. And then everyone's like, cool, what now? And we all know, like, well, with international law, there's nothing to do other than
there's no cavalry.
Like, yeah,
no, it would be a major diplomatic blow. But do
you really think so, though? I'm actually even skeptical. Part of my question is like, how much even legitimacy do they have? Will they just call the ICJ anti-Semitic and shrug and get it? Yeah, right.
They will. Yeah. And you see that now with how the ICC warrants are being handled in the legacy media in the West. It's being hushed over. Karim Khan is being smeared. The ICC is being smeared. So, this
countries are inviting the people indicted. Half of the countries
they're looking for excuses.
Yeah.
But this is still an open situation. I mean, for example, the legal establishments in states like Germany and England are unhappy about this because they do believe in the rule of law. The judges,
I don't think Netanyahu's going to go to Germany anytime soon.
The attorneys' organizations, and they are lobbying their own government. So you've got a situation where you've got governments which feel embarrassed by this or are actively hostile to the ICC. But they all claim, because they're Western states, that they embody international morality. Okay, so they're stuck here between their commitments to international law, which crystallizes international morality and international norms, on the one hand, and their loyalty to Israel. With which is not just symbolic. It's not just an extension of Europe, which is what they openly say, or an extension of the West. They also have extensive arms and security relationships, which go in both directions, incidentally. It's not just selling weapons to Israel. Yeah. Israel, as you say, sells many security and other systems, weapon systems to the Europeans, to Germany, for example. And also, German police and military elites go to Israel and meet their counterparts, hang out on the beach. They do there's lots of personal relationships as well, which have been cultivated over decades. Now, they're not going to let that go to the wall just because some international court says they're committing genocide. Yeah. They will. What we're observing is that Western states are inclined to burn down the global international legal order, which they've erected over the last 70 years, to protect their material and symbolic interest in the Middle East.
Yeah. So that question then there is when I spoke to Ilan Pappé, who the Israeli historian, he had this kind of haunting line. It sounds like a threat, but it's just an observation where he's a believer that the Palestinian cause will succeed one day. That I tend to agree that we're seeing an untenable crack in the Zionist movement and whatever. I remain optimistic despite everything, to quote Anne Frank. That he basically said, he's like, well, Palestine, and he was speaking more metaphorically about the global South, but he's like, Palestine will be liberated. Either the global North is going to have to take a stand against Israel to do this, or the global South is going to do it for them. And I think we can all read between the lines of like, that second one sounds violent and kind of World War III-ish, and that first one is maybe more something gets in the water there to do it. But my question that I want to pose to you is like, the legitimacy of something like the United Nations at all. Let's not forget, we had a League of Nations that was incredibly flawed from the very start. It was the self-determination dream, which is very much yet to be realized, that only a few countries actually joined. Woodrow Wilson's like, wait, I didn't actually mean you, Africa, just a couple. It was flawed from the beginning, and then America doesn't even join it. But it was a little thing. And when it failed, we had World War II. When the UN fails, we will have World War III. I'm almost like, whatever order those go, and it's hard to see, But my question is, if the legitimacy continues to slide, I think you just talked about it very well there. Who stops showing up first? Because I've always been the global North or the global South. Because I've always been, of course, encouraging like Palestinians, go to the UN, get resolutions, do this. But at some point, I'm like, why are they even showing up? Like, what's the point for all these small states to go there and be like, hey, that self-determination thing sounds great. By the way, what about us? Or like, hey, that genocide convention sounds kind of cool, but like, what about us? At some point, if the global South doesn't show up, maybe
Well,
that's
there's a few issues there. I mean, the
Yeah.
UN is still the only game in town. You know,
For
the General
now,
Assembly, the Human Rights Commission, and other agencies with the UN are all firmly pro-Palestine, and
Yes,
they want to recognize. They still believe in the system of states. You know, they're not revolutionaries. They want to see a Palestinian state in terms of the two-state solution, which is delusional given what's happening on the.
Completely.
But that's the diplomatic consensus, to which the US and the Europeans subscribe, by the way, although in theory, but not in practice. Now, that's one aspect. The UN is still the only game in town. You've got this blockage in the Security Council. But the other aspect is that the quote-unquote global South, does that include China? I don't know. But the
BRICS countries, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they are, most of them are not parties to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And they will also engage in the same kind of what I call diplomacy of genocide as the US. They will back their own client states if they're accused of genocide. So China excuses Myanmar. Did South Africa arrest Bashir when he was in town? I can't recall. No. Did Mongolia arrest Putin when he was in town? No. Right. So it's a very uneven situation. It's not just the global North versus the unjust global North versus unjust global South. I mean, China is the one that's incarcerating the Uyghurs and destroying to a large extent. Myanmar, backed by China, is committed this terrible Nakba-like crime against the Rohingya, who most of whom are languishing in Bangladesh, and have no hope of returning. Okay, so and Russia is the one that's engaged in this illegal and terrible war in Ukraine. It didn't need to make this choice. Right? Yeah, I'm not saying that the West is blameless here at all, right? But we don't have time to get into that. But these great powers have all made choices, and they will justify what they're doing in terms of they'll legitimize them one way or the other. They'll say they're consistent with international law. No one wants to admit that they're rogue states, unless you're North Korea or something. That is be flagrant disregard of international law. Somehow they sort of try to make it consistent with international norms. But that's still the legitimating language. When none of us can predict the future, but these states want to, the bigger states, they want to use the UN for their own purposes. Yeah. Now, until quite recently, the US has been able to dominate, various parts of the UN. The UN itself is a very complex organization. You've got the Secretary General's office, special rapporteurs. You have the General Assembly. You have the UNESCO. You have the Security Council, obviously, and you have the whole human rights architecture. And they're all doing different things at different times, and they're aligned in different ways depending on, which states can get their voice heard. For example, when the Human Rights Commission established a fact-finding commission for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and reported quite critically, the report was not acted on as far as I can recall, about 2 years ago in the Human Rights Commission, because China had convinced its members, many of whom were Muslim majority states like Turkey, not to act on it because it had such economic leverage and political leverage over these states, the Silk Road and other things. So it's behaving like the US is in relation to Israel. Right? These states will back their assets because the genocide concept is just a nuisance, law in view of a larger geopolitical game. Yeah. So that's what people forget. The bigger game here is geopolitics, and the US isn't going to let its geopolitical situation in the Middle East be impugned by what pesky international lawyers and some court says. You see those briefings at the White House briefings where report after report, whether it's Amnesty International or MSF or Human Rights Watch or what have you, allege various international crimes, among them genocide, and there's plenty of evidence to that effect as well. And it's just fobbed off by the White House spokespeople saying, well, Human Rights Watch is not in a position to make a determination about intent. It's just waved away. This
Yeah.
is, but the Chinese behave in exactly the same way.
Yeah, law will make a hypocrite of everyone, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ask you one more because I kept you for a long time, and if you could get this one really quickly at the
Sure.
end, because,
Okay.
because as you were going through that, actually I spoke when I did the Uyghur episode. It was right when that UN commission came out, and she was a little bit excited about it, and then doesn't go anywhere. If this is too much, don't answer it. But with everything you just said, sort of taking a tour around the world and maybe all of these failures, one of the common sort of criticisms and responses that you get, at least in the Jewish community I grew up in, is that, well, then why is there so much focus on the Israel one? Why is it every other UN? What's your answer or response to that? Of like, well, why are they always picking on Israel? Everyone gets to do these genocides according to this Dirk guy. Well, then why not Israel too?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of aspects. One is that Israel is consistently depicted as an outpost of the West, and gets a lot of diplomatic coverage, that is advantages, in the Security Council and elsewhere from major Western states. And what's happening to the Palestinians is flagrantly unjust. The advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice just underlines that and makes it more legal, right? So there's this I think accurate perception of hypocrisy on the part of the West, which drives lots of people crazy, because the West talks a big game about justice. Okay? Now, that's one aspect. The other aspect is that we're dealing here with the Holy Land. And so we have here, the meeting point of three major monotheistic religions. And so that means, that Muslims in Southeast Asia are very interested in what's happening and that's been the case, by the way, since the 1920s and 30s. I've taught a class on the Israel-Palestine case, and I just went looking through journals, magazines like current affairs magazines from that period. And there you will see reports that, because don't forget this is run by the British Mandate at the time, that British Indian Muslims, so somewhere in British India, are writing petitions to the British to be to be just to the Arabs of Palestine, Muslim. There's a global interest here, because it's unlike, for example, the fate of the Tamils in Sri Lanka in 2009, who were put down in very equally murderous ways by the Sri Lankan state. At that time, I think 40,000 people died, so very similar proportions. But hundreds of thousands have died in the lead up over that insurgency over the decades. But who talks about that today? Very few people. And Tamils do think this is genocide. But Sri Lanka doesn't have that same, is not backed by the West in the same way. You didn't have that sort of legacy of this imputation of hypocrisy. And our taxes payers' money are funding this genocide. You don't get that rhetoric. But B, it doesn't occupy for other parts of the world. It does obviously for South Asians, but in other parts of the world, it doesn't hold the same symbolic resonance that the Holy Land does. So look, there may be in some cases some resentment against Jewish people. I don't know. You'd have to look at a case by case basis. But I haven't seen any evidence for the proposition that all this attention is driven by anti-Semitism. I just see that.
Yeah, me either. And it's also the UN's mess in so many ways. As you know, they created the mess in 1948, and they've been obsessed with trying to fix it ever since. I'll let you go. I know you have another meeting, but this was incredible. Thank you so much. Your work's awesome. People can find you. I don't have social medias. I think you do. Follow you on Twitter and wherever else you
Blue Sky.
Blue Sky. I don't know what's what these days, but it sounds like you keep your ear to the ground there. So good on you.
Blue Sky is a vanilla Twitter. So it was great. It's great to talk to you, Jay. You're such a well-informed interlocutor, which isn't always the case. And I hope your readers and viewers and listeners find it interesting too.
Yes, I'm sure they will. Yes, thank you so much. Take care. So I obviously loved that conversation, and there's frankly much more to discuss with Dirk Moses. In particular, we didn't get to talk too much about his ideas about the language of transgression. That I think is really important. Maybe I'll have him back on in the future. I would obviously really love that. So I also really love the idea of the mentality of absolute safety and permanent security, and then thinking about that on an individual scale, of kind of a human life worth living, which I think really does necessitate a degree of hazard or potential danger. I think the best dystopian films and books whether they lean more towards Huxley or Orwell, are always about this mistake and this mentality. Absolute safety exists in virtual worlds where death and pain are only illusions and simulations of the genuine experience. Actual humane worlds cannot guarantee safety or even peace. That is the cost, in my view, of the human condition. And a world which might actually obtain a degree of absolute safety, but can only arrive at that state through a process, of a series of unspeakable atrocities or genocides or crimes, is not a world worth winning. Those are worlds which drink from the poisoned wells of their history, which inevitably collapse under the weight of their own moral shadows. Those false utopias are always rejected in our hero stories, where the protagonist rebels against the safety and security of the world to free the safe but imprisoned people within it. I'm thinking here of Wall-E, Brave New World, The Giver, Fahrenheit 451, 1984, Logan's Run, The Matrix, Snowpiercer. Basically, every single dystopian story shares the same basic premise, and for good reason. So there's much more to philosophize about that, but I will save that for a future conversation or potential essay. And then quickly here, I also mentioned an old audio-only episode that I did about the Uyghur situation, which I linked to in the description. My guest was an incredible activist named Rahima Mahmoud, and please go listen to it. It's a situation that, while almost entirely overshadowed and forgotten at this point in the Western press, is still extremely urgent, no matter what label you put on it. I hope that if the conversation with Dirk Moses landed for you at all, it should be that we ought to fixate less on what we linguistically label horrific, unjust, and immoral actions, intentions, situations, and just work to rectify them as quickly as possible. In that episode and in that conversation, she shares some Uyghur poetry and music, and it's quite beautiful. Please listen to it. But now I want to go back to the thing about genocide and the Jewish Holocaust and post-Holocaust Jewish experience, because there really is much more to discuss here, and there may be some topics which Dirk was hesitant to touch that I feel a bit more comfortable getting into. So, to the Palestinian, does it matter what we call what's happening? Does it matter what label gets applied to the indiscriminate, intentional bombing that mutilates and disintegrates entire families? Does it matter if I come up with a kind of term, like, let's say, something oxymoronic, like collateral damage maximization policies? I mean, I think that's actually a pretty clever term to describe the policy of the type of IDF bombing campaign that we're seeing. I mean, if the term collateral damage makes conceptual sense to describe any situation where you have any target in mind and there are just going to be unavoidable bad consequences that come along with it, well, fine. Let me give a toy example using people here that I've used elsewhere. But, imagine you have information that a man just got into a car and loaded it up with explosives. And from, solid gathered information, you have, a really solid reason to believe that he's going to drive this car straight into a wedding party where 100 people are laughing and dancing. And you are holding a bazooka, and you can shoot the car and obviously explode and destroy it. And he's driving straight for the wedding party, and you have a clear shot. But just before you shoot, you notice that his 5-year-old daughter is in the back seat of the car. Do you shoot the bazooka knowing that this will kill her? And of course, we'll leave aside all of the obviously relevant information about justice, about how that situation got into that place and why he's driving the car in the first place. But don't worry about that mess. Just the idea of collateral damage, even in that nightmare dilemma situation, again, makes conceptual sense. Keep in mind that, though it doesn't actually dictate exactly what you should do morally. The utilitarian certainly has his answer, and the virtue ethicist will have a different one, perhaps, and the deontologist might have a different one, and divine command theory Christians might have a different one. So I'll leave those interesting moral philosophy debates aside and just shrug and say that I understand the idea of collateral damage as an idea there, but I'll also just mark that I personally object to the notion of referring to humans, any humans, with the term collateral damage. But anyway, setting all that aside and using square quotes then, for collateral damage minimalization policies, it could lead to the answer of blowing up the car and considering the 5-year-old girl in the back seat as a result, with minimization of collateral damage. Obviously, even more minimal might be if you could quickly swap out the bazooka with a sniper rifle and just take out the driver. And even better than that might be to get some kind of, neutralization ray gun from future technology, which disables the car and all the explosives, magically in it. Anyway, as Dirk and I pointed out, this is precisely the opposite of what the IDF is doing with AI programs like Lavender and Where's Daddy. They are perversely waiting until that target is surrounded by the proverbial wedding party and swapping out their bazooka, not with a sniper rifle often, but with a 2,000-pound bomb to raise the possibilities of maximizing the collateral damage around what they know because of the shenanigans of international law that we discussed and the social elevation of genocide to seemingly the only war crime that people seem to care about to be a legitimate military target. Hence, collateral damage maximization. So hopefully that puts an end to the racism of leaning into the human shields arguments as drawing some kind of meaningful line between, the values of the civilizations here. It was once said that human shielding as a tactic only existed because it would work, meaning that if they used it, the IDF would hold their fire when human shields were used, and how that situation couldn't be imagined in the inverse. Well, yeah, precisely the opposite is happening. The more shields, the better, apparently, according to IDF policy. But anyway, does it matter that that term that I just introduced fits perfectly or not? Does it matter if we quibble over whether Zionism and the state of Israel fits some abstract concept of settler colonialism, so we can lump America, Australia, and maybe South Africa into the same bin? Or no, does it not quite fit because of, the variable of a biblical story based on shoddy, biased archaeological work reaching back 2,000 years, laying the incredibly loose groundwork for a claim about indigenousness? Does that variable mean that Zionism should be carved out and given a different and more unique categorization than settler colonialism? Does any of that matter to the Palestinian experience for the past 125 years or so? And as Dirk Moses pointed out, the Jews themselves didn't have a word or a name for what was happening to them in 1943. Did that matter to them? If they had had a name for it, which maybe if it was used by some major international publication in 1942 or 3 or something, would that have immediately alerted the world to a direct historical analogy and triggered something in us, so the categorization locked in that, we knew that this was something immoral and horrible and out of bounds, and, we would have to help them? The real question is, though, I think, does naming it actually help prevent it from happening again? Does it help us quickly recognize something that we consider to be out of bounds in order to, quickly ignite a response? Does the word do that? Do words do that? And that point, that's the one that possibly can rescue the field of genocide studies, because maybe it can. Words do matter. But as you've seen, the field and our collective conversation about this idea of genocide has been badly corrupted and is clearly now at a breaking point. Because if the naming becomes so closely tied to a specific case and so limited in specific historical aesthetics that it doesn't leave room for anything else, then what good is it? Why give it 2 names? It actually ends up doing precisely the opposite, preventing it from happening again. It allows for much more of it, or as Dirk says, allows for many things worse than genocide to escape our focus and concern. So I want to think more about this word genocide and why it does matter so much. And I mean emotionally here now. The question of whether or not Israel is committing a genocide. So legally, that's an argument. I'm talking emotionally. So as Dirk pointed out, some Israeli scholars even are okay describing what they're doing as criminal or dirty or immoral or whatever, but not genocide. Anything but genocide, which is also the experience in my family growing up. So I'm going to keep my streak here, I think, going of mentioning my mother in just about every episode I do, because, so many of these talks and conversations do have me thinking about her and her positions and her process. She's always been pretty vulnerable and open with this stuff, actually. So she describes herself as an atheist, though Jewish, ethnically, culturally, whatever that means to her. But she always tells me that when her atheism was sort of locked in, there was a story, I think when she was a teenager, she learned it, but she was learning about the Jewish genocide in World War II, otherwise known as the Holocaust. And specifically, she was learning about a story about a Nazi soldier who takes a Jewish baby and swings it against a tree to obviously kill it and get rid of it. So she says, it was in that moment that she thought, no God could exist that would allow that. This, by the way, for the philosophy folks in the crowd, is just known as the problem of evil. And there's endless debates from theists and atheists and everyone in between alike about this problem. But anyway, this was her moment, a kind of shattering of faith of sorts, right? There is no God, or if there is, he's certainly not God the way we want to think of him. It's an empty concept. And mind you, I'm writing this outro and recording it right now on a day where 4 Palestinian babies froze to death. And thinking about that, by the way, is just a perfect mirror of this moral clinging that people do to really want to draw a difference, where the Jewish baby in that story by the Nazis, the target of that violence, while those 4 Palestinian babies that froze to death are, thought of as collateral damage, which, unfortunately come along with the struggle against legitimate military targets, all in the name of safety, of course, right? Again, it's reasoning that has been overwhelmingly taken apart and challenged by mountains of evidence and behavior. But what's important from Dirk Moses' idea is to recognize that the Israeli arguments about those 4 frozen babies actually represents security concerns, because maybe they could grow up to become, threats. That's in play, it's in the cards, and it's echoed by the rhetoric you heard of collaborating populations and stuff like that being shuffled out by apologists. So that's the permanent security mentality, which is really infinitely flexible and able to justify just about any kind of crime. Think about anything a state can do or a military could do, and you could always point to a potential threat and make a case for it in some degree and do what you want to do. But back to that Nazi and the Jewish baby and my mother's loss of faith. I think what's really happening there is not necessarily a loss of faith in God per se, but actually in man, in the potential for man, and seeing the potential for man to reach that level of inhumanity and depravity. That the Nazi in that story, is a fully inhumane entity. It becomes evil, a sort of supernatural evil. Or, of course, here's the real kicker in the loss of faith piece, that he is actually human, and this is what humans can do, that we can do this to each other. And then I think what happens is actually another step of retreat into faith, a deeper one than even the God concept, one that says that we'll learn from these things, or one that transfers that evil from the realm of God, because he no longer exists, and puts it into man, makes man evil. But the question then is that evil placed in all men or only certain men? And here's, I think, of another pop culture mythology that I'm a big fan of. So the founding mythology of the X-Men series, and in particular the Magneto story. So Magneto is considered sort of the main adversary and villain of the X-Men world, and his backstory is really kind of incredible. So he was born with the name Max Eisenhardt, and he experiences the Holocaust and Nazi concentration camps. He's Jewish. He witnesses the horrors of that genocide, and in one of the more recent films, you see Nazis liquidating a ghetto, or it might be Auschwitz actually, where they're separating him from his mother, and surely sending them off to their deaths, and he freaks out in horror, and also in that moment sort of discovers his mutant genetic power of magnetism, and the metal gates start to bend. Anyway, the point is that Max, as a young boy and teenager, sees the absolute worst in humanity and suffers immense cruelty. And he concludes that mutants must dominate or destroy humanity in order to prevent their persecution and bring about a better, more advanced world. This philosophy puts him at odds with his longtime friend, Charles Xavier, known as Professor X, who also has experienced some prejudice but believes in the possibility of coexistence between mutants and humans. Magneto sees Xavier's idealism as naive, arguing that efforts to save humanity only delay the inevitable rise of mutant oppression. And their philosophical battle embodies, the tension between despair and hope. Magneto's approach is one of survival through dominance, while Professor X insists on striving for mutual understanding and peace, believing humanity's better nature is worth nurturing. And when that mythology is adapted well on screen or elsewhere, you as a reader or viewer certainly see that both sides of the argument have some potential validity. There's a great scene, it's also plucked from the comic books, at the end of one of the movies, or several of the movies, I think, where the two men are seen playing chess, representing this teetering of faith and gamesmanship between these two philosophies. And then as a note, this backstory for Magneto was introduced in 1981, so not in the original X-Men, by a writer named Charles Claremont. Not so sure how, the ADL or Mary Jane Ryan, for that matter, might respond today to the introduction of a Jewish supervillain who preaches necessary dominance in the name of absolute safety and a civilizational clash. But anyway, I think it's really, really a brilliant piece of modern day mythology. And I think it really points to where we are at now. The moral caution of the Magneto character, it's not very deeply hidden there. I mean, a Jewish boy experiences some of the worst dehumanization and violence by a group of people who are convinced that they must purify the nation in order to bring about a peaceful, egalitarian future, and then concludes that he actually belongs to a genetic mutation which must eliminate or dominate others in order to bring about that world. And in any case, those others have, forfeited their claim to sympathy or life by their compliance with his oppression. So the question of Magneto is, did he become what he hated? Did he stare into the abyss long enough that the abyss stared back? And of course, he would insist that no, he hasn't. He's different. He gets accused of being a Nazi or Nazi mentality in a lot of the comics. And he would say no, not just because of his inherent accidental genetic qualities, but because he's not eliminating non-mutants because they are non-mutant, but because of their behavior and because of the danger they represent. That's what Magneto would say separates him from the Nazis who killed his family. Does that sound familiar at all? Magneto gets accused of this, of embodying this plenty of times. I'll actually link to a YouTube video from this cool video I saw from Comics Bazaar that he goes through that entire 1981 issue where Magneto's backstory is introduced. It's actually quite good. You probably never knew comic books were so deeply political and philosophical. So, as with Magneto, as with my mother, as with much of the psyche of the post-Holocaust Judaism, because of course Magneto actually experienced the Holocaust firsthand. My mother's a generation removed. I'm a couple more. But this mentality, I think, is relevant to this conversation. Criticism is okay to a degree. Perhaps accusing them of crime to a degree, going too far, bad actions, but just not genocide, just not that word, especially not now, not just less than 100 years after suffering our own. Again, I didn't suffer it, neither did my mother. But it's just too dark. That shattering of faith and revelation about even deeper depths of the human capacity for destruction is just too much, and so it's denied. And Dirk nor I want to push any conspiracies here, but it's worth looking at the extremely troubling efforts during decades from 1945 to 2000s or so by Zionist groups who were actively denying a platform or even remembrance for other genocides to appear alongside Holocaust remembrance. And whether that was intentional or systemic or planned or not, it continued to promote the intertwining of the specific historical aesthetics of the Holocaust with the general concept of genocide. This really harkens back to a clip that I played in the middle of my interview with David Sinai from 1992 with Yeshua Leibovitz and Tommy Lapid, in which Lapid harps on the idea that there are no gas chambers or concentration camps in Gaza. And this is some kind of, knockdown point, which means they don't harbor genocidal intent, the Israelis. I'll just play it again now, actually, because I think it's not too long and it belongs here as well.
ובמצב הזה שבו אתה מקבל מהממשלה הזאת, שכבר הזכרתי שאתה קראת לה ממשלת המדינה היהודו-נאצית, כשאתה מקבל ממנה את הפרס הזה, האם אתה עדיין סבור, כפי שאמרת פה בתוכניתנו לפני זמן קצר, שזו מדינה בלתי דמוקרטית?
יש שני דברים בדבר. הדבר הראשון, שמאחר שאתה העלית אותו, אני צריך להתייחס אליו, אף שמעולם לא מצאתי לנחוץ להתייחס אליו. כאילו אני אמרתי מדינה נאצית. יודו-נאצית. יודו-נאצי, השתמשתי בו בקשר למנטליות מסוימת הקיימת בחוגים מסוימים. יש מנטליות יודו-נאצית בחוגים מסוימים. זה היה המקרה האחד והיחיד שבו השתמש בביטוי יודו-נאצי.
היית חוזר רק בך מהביטוי הזה לכבוד האווירה הנינוחה של הפרס?
המנטליות היודו-נאצית בחוגים מסוימים קיימת ועומדת.
יהודים ששורפים ערבים להנאתם, כמה מיליוני ערבים, פרופסור ליבוביץ', נכון? חוגים מסוימים ששאיפתם היא להקים מחנות ריכוז ולשרוף בקרמטוריום ערבים.
ידוע לי שמדינת ישראל מחזיקה במחנות ריכוז הרבה אלפים ערבים.
ומדי פעם מכניסה אותם לתאי גזים ואחר כך שורפת אותם.
אני יודע שמדינת ישראל מחזיקה במחנות ריכוז הרבה אלפים ערבים.
ואחר כך שורפת אותם. ומכניסה אותם לתאי גזים. פרופסור ליבוביץ', אתה מאשים את
אני דיברתי עברית ברורה. אני יודע שמדינת ישראל מחזיקה במחנות ריכוז כמה אלפים ערבים.
ואחר כך שורפת אותם. ומכניסה אותם לתאי גזים.
זה נבואתך. זה נבואת העתיד שלך.
רבותיי, אני רוצה לבקש ממך, חנן פה.
So this is really where we're at. Is Leibovitz's dark prophecy unfolding before us? If Israel, the Jewish community, and the faithful onlookers can contend that Israel might be doing some really bad things, but they aren't committing a genocide, then this tiny shred of faith in man remains intact. And so they cling to that word, genocide, and protect it fiercely. But perhaps they're doing something worse than genocide, it turns out. Magneto, with his mutant abilities and his mutant allies, has far more destructive power than the humans in the X-Men universe or the Nazis. And his argument that his actions are not driven by hatred and prejudice or even supremacy, but by safety and civilizational Darwinianism, that's what he thinks saves him from being identical to the mindsets and actions which killed his mother. I think that difference is really a mirage. And I'm more convinced than ever after talking to Dirk Moses that, of course, it leads to something that's actually far worse. And so to finish this, and to underline that point, I want to share something that I came across a while back. It was from this really fantastic video essay from this channel called From the Periphery. The whole thing is really worth watching, but right up front, the host named Ayman Makarem, sorry if I mispronounced that, Ayman, makes reference to a movie entitled Our Music, or Notre Musique, by Jean-Luc Godard, and a particular scene from that movie featuring Mahmoud Darwish that really stuck with him. And he offers his interpretation of the scene, and it's really quite good, but I'd like to offer mine too with all of those preceding thoughts, and the question of something worse than genocide that we're dealing with now. Is Israel, the self-proclaimed homeland for the Jewish people, complicit now? And what should we call it, if anything? That's the question that has led to a civil war, not just in the academic departments that you heard a bit about, but in the Jewish community itself, with the not in our name groups and the Jewish Voices for Peace and Breaking the Silence types. And in the end, some piece of the human psyche is watching all of this unfold and hoping that it isn't true because of what kind of deep darkness it reveals about us, about what we humans are capable of doing. So when the cliched chant is repeated of the whole world is watching, I think they're watching this situation for a particular reason. And I think that's echoed in the clip that I'm about to show you. And this is the clip that was featured in Ayman's video essay, which stuck with him so much and now very much sticks with me as well.
هل تعلمين لماذا نحن الفلسطينيين مشهورون؟ لأنكم أنتم أعداؤنا. إن الاهتمام بنا نابع من الاهتمام بالمسألة اليهودية. نعم، الاهتمام بك وليس بي أنا. إذن نحن قليلو الحظ في أن تكون إسرائيل هي عدونا، لأنها تحظى بمؤيدين لا حد لهم في العالم. ونحن أيضا محظوظون لأن تكون إسرائيل عدونا، لأن اليهود هم مركز اهتمام العالم. لذلك ألحقتم بنا الهزيمة وأعطيتمونا الشهرة. لقد ألحقتم بنا الهزيمة ولكن منحتمونا الشهرة.